Got a nice workout coming up there. I use the chair I use it as I use it as a table. Okay. All right, good. Well, welcome. We have 30 minutes to discuss what is probably the most important aspect of this Opportunity Zones policy. And that is, how do these investments and how do we guarantee that these investments have a positive impact on the existing residents of distressed communities? Positive impact on the existing residents of distressed communities. So my name is Shay Hawkins. I am the president of the Opportunity Funds Association, which works to preserve, reasonably expand, and ultimately extend the Opportunity Zones policy. And we communicate the good work that Opportunity Funds are doing in distressed communities. And before that, I worked for Senator Tim Scott and closely with the Economic Innovation Group and others to help get this policy across the finish line. And I have a very distinguished panel here of folks who represent different aspects of the Opportunity Zones policy and process, but that all have a unique perspective on impact. And so we only got 30 minutes. I'm not going to walk through each of their bios. I'm just going to introduce them and then let them jump right in so they can talk. You won't hear as much from me. But we have Peter Truog, who is the founder of the Opportunity Exchange, which exists to produce equitable, transparent, and efficient outcomes in Opportunity Zones. Next, we have Jen Collins. Jen Collins is the head of the Beeck Center at Georgetown University. They were a critical part of creating the first workable standard in terms of a voluntary impact framework. And so that's going to be really key going forward, amongst folks like the folks at Virtua and the folks at SC Opportunity Funds that say, look, we want to step forward and be on the forefront of reporting and transparency. How do we do that? And then finally, we've got George Ashton from LISC. George is a long-time sort of serial entrepreneur himself, and the folks at LISC brought him in to really spearhead this policy, which is oriented towards entrepreneurs. And so, George, I mentioned you last, but just tell us a little bit about how LISC is approaching impact and opportunity zones.
Happy to do so. So LISC is a national CDFI by corporate structure and nonprofit. We have been investing in underserved communities all over the country for about 40 years now. We've done about $20 billion of investments between tax credits, LIHTC, and new markets, pre-development debt on projects, construction debt as well, and now some equity investing also. So we really are an investor in the space. We just started an office. We have 35 offices across the country, soon to be 37. We just started an office here in Greenville, and our executive director is somewhere around here. Julie's in the back there, waving her hand. And what we try to do in each of these communities is bring some of the national resources, whether it's HUD 4 grants, HUD Section 4 grants, or grants and program work, the tax credit stuff, and the other types of capital into these areas to really try to create impact and change for these communities. And so, having done that for a long time, when Opportunity Zone legislation dropped, we were obviously asking the question, how can we utilize this new tool to affect that same change? And so we've been doing a lot in this space. We have some equity investment funds that we're deploying around the country on behalf of banks or private high net worth individuals or NBA players and otherwise that we're working on as well. And then we, on the project side, have a few programs to do pre-development grant funding to projects in a few cities around the country that are really projects that are focused on impact in these zones. And then we've also done some thought leadership with a playbook that we launched online as well. So there's more, but that's just a little bit of what we've been doing in Opportunity Zones.
So Jen, can you tell us a little bit about the Beeck Center and your work with Opportunity Zones? I mean, I know obviously, the Beeck Center has kind of a broad portfolio, but tell us a little bit about your work around Opportunity Zones.
Yeah, happy to. So we are, the Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation, like our namesake suggests, we are a center that exists to drive impact and create and incubate new ideas. We really focus on systems change nationwide. We have two bodies of work, data and digital side, and then a fair finance initiative. So our fair finance initiative takes a look at the systems and structures undergirding capitalism that perpetuate inequity across our country. Our Opportunity Zones team fits within that. And the work of our team is really to support the original intention of the legislation, which is to really promote positive social outcomes in these neighborhoods. So I have the best job in the world. I have a national lens on the Opportunity Zone landscape. I am a hub for Opportunity Zone conversation for anybody who's socially minded and really wants to drive positive social outcomes in these neighborhoods. So I'm grateful to be flanked by the three of you who make me look good, because you do what I think about. So it's always great. But we're really a think tank that does. We're a nonprofit that sits on Georgetown's campus, so we put together intergenerational teams to do the work that I just described.
Excellent. Now, Peter, one thing that's kind of unique about the Opportunity Exchange, if I understand it correctly, that was structured pretty much around this policy. So it's an organization that was built around this. And so I find that, very interesting, because it's almost like you wouldn't have a job if I didn't do my job well. That's a joke.
Neither would I.
Yeah, many of us
Thank you,
here.
Shay.
But tell us a little bit about the Opportunity Exchange and how you guys approach this, how you guys produce these equitable, transparent, and efficient outcomes.
Yeah, happy to. And echoing the other folks on the stage here, really honored to be up here. And excited to share a little bit about the Opportunity Exchange and the work we do with you all here today. The way that we got started doing this work prior to creating the Opportunity Exchange, I was working in community and economic development in Northeast Ohio. We're a Cleveland-based company, doing a role not dissimilar from that which Ben was describing on the previous panel, working to help connect the dots between communities in Northeast Ohio, investors, and the project sponsors that are within them. And it was really clear, two things were abundantly clear as a result of that work. One was that there's a ton of energy about the potential of this program, right? We have a couple hundred people in the room here today as evidence of that. But no matter where along those three legs of the stool you sit, whether you're a community leader, whether you're a developer, business owner, whether you're an investor, ton of energy about what's going on here, which is great. The other thing, though, is that there's a lot of questions about how to take the next step, right? How do people get more involved? And given that this incentive exists, what should we be doing now? And a lot of those questions, kind of initially, especially oriented around how do we get connected, right? As a city or a state, what should we be doing to identify projects in our community and get the word out about those? As a developer, what do I need to put together? How do I talk about the work that I'm doing in general, but also from an impact perspective? As an investor, great, I'd love to think about investing in Cleveland. Where should I go to understand how to get connected? Answering those questions at the core of what the Opportunity Exchange does, where we partner with cities, states across the country to help showcase their kind of pipeline of Opportunity Zone projects, and in so doing, execute against this impact mission, which is at the core of kind of why we're on the stage here. We think about this question in two ways. One is by working directly with communities to help them showcase and advance projects that meet the objectives and long-term development goals of their community. We believe that's a strategy for influencing outcomes in the Opportunity Zone space, and a way to help really highlight and lift up projects that kind of are very closely aligned with the direction that the communities we work in want to go. The other is following the leadership of Jen and her work in particular, but is really believing in the importance of transparent data collection and impact reporting. So through a lot of the thought leadership from the Beeck Center and others, with like their OZ framework and their suggested impact reporting guidelines, we've really embraced that and adopted that into the work that we do, such that we provide really clear data and reporting back to the communities that we work with around the types of projects we see in their community. We have kind of the ability for folks who use the platform to really clearly communicate their impact objectives in alignment with the framework, which I'm sure Jen, you'll talk more about. And so it's kind of through these different channels that we really try to hope to be helpful players and a tool that folks can use to advance this impact mission.
So what role do you think, I mean, we're here, in South Carolina, there's a lot of folks here that we've heard from, in state government or who are involved in local government. What role does state and local government have in ensuring that the existing residents of distressed communities benefit from this policy?
Okay, I'll start. So we actually put together a playbook that I mentioned before aimed at community stakeholders. And really what I want to talk about is how we came to the notion we needed to do that. We had a number of cities calling us because we have offices in all these locations saying like how should we get involved? Economic development departments typically calling us to say, hey, listen, we want investment in our town. We also want it to reflect what the community wants. What should we do? And in some cases calling us to say there is some investment coming. It's not quite what people want. We had a storage unit, a storage unit place open up over here, or a dialysis center over there, where there's already 3 of them there. Like, that's not what we want. How do we get what we want? And so I think state and local government needs to be involved in a few different ways. One is providing a way to convene the community itself, which can be done by local community participants, CDCs, and those types of folks as well. But certainly when it comes down from the top, it actually adds a little more gravitas to getting folks together. So I think that's part of it, and having those voices heard. And then it's all the smart development policies that can come out of, I call it offense and defense. The defense is, smart development ordinances, requirements around affordable housing for new developments, sustainability requirements around new developments, things that really provide some guardrails for what comes in terms of development growth in those areas. And then on offense, it's stuff you've heard already, like TIFs and other incentives, property tax abatement, or whatever else that can actually, or improving the development process for projects that are particularly well positioned for impact. So it's sort of an offense and defense that the government should play to try to set the playing field so that you get what you want out of opportunity zones.
I would answer that as I would echo everything that George said, which I rarely do, so to take that for what it's worth. But we developed this opportunity zone impact reporting framework, which Peter alluded to. I'm proud to have 3 adopters on stage with me. And what we did when the legislation was originally passed and the impact language was stripped, we decided that we wanted to take a run at getting impact back into the landscape and really pushing for it. So that was the thought, the problem that we wanted to solve, the mission that we wanted to push. So we put a lot of thought into the Opportunity Zone Impact Reporting Framework as we developed it. We coordinated and got comments from a whole multitude of stakeholders. So we talked to local government, we talked to federal government, we talked to private real estate investors and developers, we talked to wealth managers, we talked to philanthropy, because we wanted it to be able to be used by all of those different stakeholders. The most precious thing, in my opinion, about Opportunity Zone legislation is the conversation swell around it. So it is bringing together all of those stakeholders that have never been at the same tables before. And I do believe that that's where innovation comes from. And I know that the world of community development needs new ideas. So I'm grateful for the side effect of opportunities and legislation because of the innovation that I see it driving every day. But going back to the framework, our framework has 5 guiding principles, really simple. And so as we heard from all these stakeholders as we were putting it together, we heard 3 things. 1, please only have one impact framework for the field. Don't muddy it, right? So we don't need 7. It's going to be confusing. So we partnered with the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as we developed it so that we only had one for the field. And we launched it in February of last year. So we tried to get out in front of the field and really work with first movers the best we could. The second thing we heard was, please make it simple. Don't create an impact tax. For lack of a better word. We don't want to make this any harder than it has to be for people to think through it. I think there's actually a lot of impact investors through real estate who exist who have just never called themselves that before. So we are seeing a lot of new players come to the field of impact through this legislation. And the third thing was make it flexible. So we wanted anybody to be able to use this framework, which is housed at ozframework.org if you guys want to take a look at it. But we wanted a guy who's focused on access to healthy foods to be able to use it, as well as somebody who's really rowing towards the future of energy or an education outcome. So the great news is we have all these stakeholders using it. We have a lot of adoption from the world of philanthropy and government and private investors. So that was our real call to action to help people think through it. And we are very grateful to see local and local government especially coming up with some really innovative ways of using and implementing the framework. So we're seeing some twinning legislation that's driving impact. Alabama is taking a pretty big lead on this in driving impact behavior. The state of Maryland's also doing great things in driving some impact behavior. But we're also trying to understand what at the local level the communities actually need. So in a lot of the big urban markets, permits need to be expedited. The permit process takes forever. Even in Baltimore, which is not one of the top 3 markets, but Baltimore, we have put together an Opportunity Zone Investor Council. Dave Bramble, MCB Real Estate, has 3 zone projects in Baltimore. He is a very well-connected developer in the city of Baltimore. It took him 4 years to get entitled on his Yard 56 project that he's doing with Prudential. So that's just a need in particular cities. So if permits need to be expedited, anything that will really help drive project and project development. So it's really understanding what's hindering the projects from being done, and that can vary state by state, even local jurisdiction to local jurisdiction. So it's understanding that need and being able to address that need, which you can do especially at the local level.
One of the questions that we often hear on this is how. Particularly on the community side, and I think, again, to reference Ben, a great example that has been embraced also by the Rockefeller Foundation recently. I think a really fundamental component of this is capacity. Whether it's a full-time person, if you're lucky enough to be able to support that as a community, if not, a different model that we've seen emerge. It's kind of these collaborative working group models. I'll reference specifically in Cleveland as a way to achieve a lot of the goals that George and Jen just outlined. In Cleveland, they don't have a full-time Opportunity Zone coordinator running point in the city, but they're still tackling a lot of these same questions and moving the ball forward. They have a collaborative effort between the city, the county, the Chamber of Commerce, local philanthropy, and the local land bank, who have together agreed to meet bi-weekly for half an hour to 60 minutes and go through the suite of activities that we've kind of covered today that are core to a community OZ impact strategy, pipeline identification, marketing strategy, technical assistance, things like that. And so even in cases where you're not in the position to have a full-time coordinator doing this role, I think the key thing is that there's still models and strategies that can work for you to enable you to proactively step into this space.
So how can we guarantee that this conversation around impact includes entrepreneurs and Opportunity Zone residents and not just politicians and nonprofit execs and folks like that? How can we get the real stakeholders into the conversation?
So I would echo some of what George has said and commend the work that Peter's done because the connection and education is really critically important. And it's complicated and it's hard because there are power dynamics at play, there is race at play, there is capitalistic tendencies at play. And so this can be really hard and and scary and messy sometimes. So I really support, the Opportunity Zone coordinator model. I know LISC is working with Rockefeller on boosting some of the human capital and capacity at the local level, which is sorely needed. But a lot of times there's a translation issue. And so anybody, I would call on anybody in the room, anybody who's in the ability to act as a translator, by in between these worlds is really incredibly helpful, super helpful to the field. If you have access to community level folks, if you can set some tables for this type of conversation to happen, I would echo the call for convening. I think government can play a role there. I think local foundations can play a role there. Anybody who can convene locally to really get that community voice. And then we have 5 guiding principles in our framework. The first one is community engagement. And it's kind of like, if the first one isn't hit, I don't really care about the other 4. So community engagement, and I'm seeing the most interesting and impactful community engagement being community members involved in the capital stack of these projects. So I am seeing some projects that are involving community by involving them in various interesting ways as part of the capital stacks to be able to help with wealth creation in some of these communities.
And of course, the difficulty with involving the capital stack sometimes is that only capital gains can be in the capital stack. And in lots of these communities, folks don't have capital gains in the areas that have been underinvested. But there are other ways, as Jen refers to, that we can get them involved in the capital stack as well. I'll give you a test case. The best one that I've seen, and it's one that I've been involved in as well, is down in Charlotte. And I actually worked with Jeannie down in Charlotte on this. So we have an office down there. Federal Reserve Bank is down there. Foundation for the Carolinas is down there. And we all got together and with one of the local universities in this historically black neighborhood, put together a fairly large convening to actually get the community itself to come out. Now, painfully, these convenings are on a Saturday. I live in Washington, D.C. I have 2 kids. So being in Charlotte on a Saturday is the painful part about that. But we've done it twice now, or we actually done it once, and we're going to do it again here coming up. But you have to do it when it's accessible by the community. So that's not during business hours on like a Monday through Friday. That's like a Saturday convening.
Yes.
And then we got them in the room, and the greatest thing happened. It was really Jeannie's idea was, hey, let's put together, let's get their input on what they want to see in their community. Because a lot of these communities feel like they have not been invested in, and they have a culture and they have a history that they want respected in what's developed in their communities. So we got some ideas from the community, directly from folks just raising their hand. I want a library, I want an art space, I want a whatever. And then working with Jeannie and others, we put together a prospectus for so pulling those ideas together. But as we were in the room, this is the gap that you're talking about. People who own sites, whether they were commercial sites or individual homes, were like, hey, listen, I'm okay with, I'm older, I'm okay with selling out of my site, but I don't know anything about real estate investing, and like, who am I going to talk to, and how am I going to structure these deals, and how do I make sure that I don't look at my community in 5 or 10 years and it looks completely different than it looks today. And so they've sort of bought into the mission in this concept, but there's a technical assistance gap there. And so what we're trying to think through down in Charlotte is, how do we provide education and information, but also maybe some models for empowering people to work together to have their vision for their community effectuated by developers. Because without working together, my fear is they get picked off one by one, and it doesn't end up being what they want it to be. It turns into a whole different type of community. And so really, when you dig down and you start talking to the people in these communities, that's where there's a lot of work to be done on technical assistance and models for helping them be a part of whatever the growth is in their communities.
I think this is like part of the next frontier of trying to figure out this community impact work on OZs is more direct resident engagement. An example has been cited before, but I'll just add a little bit more color, is what's been happening in Birmingham, where the city has elected to literally have people on repeated instances at times that work for people throughout the course of the day, collect survey information from residents of various OZ communities as a way to collect really grassroots input about what they'd like to see. So, right, kind of building on what George was saying, is like, what are models that exist to do that? And then how do you solidify, codify that information and use it as a way to think about prioritization across your broader community's pipeline? If community A says they want a certain type of project, well, do we have those in our pipeline? If not, how can we build that? What technical assistance do we need to do so? And then how do we think about connecting investors to those projects? You can see a way that a few more steps down the road, that like value chain could be really, really solidified through these types of processes.
If I could get just one more example, in Milwaukee, the other way to do this is there are local developers in these communities, community development corporations, that are already in and of the community and have an idea of what the community needs and actually are very responsive and accountable to the community. But many of them are struggling to figure out how to put together capital stacks for their projects that would involve OZ equity, because traditionally their projects have been with federal tax credits and grant and soft money. And so we did a session in Milwaukee where we pulled a bunch of these types of developers in a room and had bankers and lawyers and accountants just meet with them for like 15 minutes at a time or 20 minutes at a time to try to give them the technical assistance to get their projects to move forward. So that was a bit more removed from the community itself, although those are representatives of the community. But again, those ideas of technical assistance and capital coming to the table.
That makes sense. So what do you think, so we're getting close to closing thoughts here, so I'll start with Peter on this, and then we'll just kind of move down. Peter, what do you think is the single most important thing that the private sector can do to encourage positive social impact for the residents of distressed communities and OZs?
Big question.
I'm a big question kind of guy, Peter. So that's right.
Love it. I think that the biggest thing that we've seen so far in our experience is just leaning into these conversations. I think a lot of this is building new muscle, and like Jen was saying, there's kind of a need for writing in like a new Rosetta Stone for economic and community development, and helping translate between parties who historically oftentimes haven't communicated at all, and that can be scary and really challenging for everybody involved. We've seen some really positive examples. We've cited some among numerous others. But I think embracing this type of conversation can go a long way towards starting to build the trust and foundation that really lies at the core of a lot of the change that I think we're trying to make.
I would say commit to our framework. I have an 18-year career in real estate investment and development, so I brought that lens and that voice to the development of the framework, and I had a lot of very heated dialogue with colleagues about overtaxing, overburdening anybody who is inclined towards impact, because I don't want this to be any harder than it has to be. So we came up with these 5 guiding principles. We're now coming up with an impact process tool, because we've gotten a lot of like, your framework's great, but now what? So we put together an Opportunity Zone Investor Council. It's a group of 15 influential investors, developers, and fund managers. George is on our council. Peter is helping inform our council. But we are getting real-time practitioner feedback on this, but we're also coming up with an impact process tool that will be open source, so we'll launch it likely in the spring. But it will be an impact process tool specifically focused on the investor and developer community, on the process to help you operationalize our framework.
My answer sort of ties in to both what was said earlier. I mean, there are, for private sector developers out there, doing things the right way, to Jen's point, and Peter sees some of these projects as well. And we need those guys to speak up and talk about the benefits of doing that. And so really private sector working with academia, it reminds me of what happened, or what's already happened a little bit in the corporate space, where investors are now starting to pay more for stock shares in companies that have good employee retention and are doing environmentally sustainable practices. I like to think of it's because they feel good about it, and that may be some of it, but actually they've proven that there are long-term benefits to the performance of the company from doing these things. Well, the same is actually true in real estate. So if you look at the long-term performance of real estate assets, those assets that are more reflective of the desires and wants and history of the community around them, long-term perform better as an asset class. And particularly in this, for where we are at in the economic cycle and where we're at in the real estate cycle, it's actually, many of the largest pension funds in this country are investing in things like workforce housing as much as they can, right? Because the luxury market is, frankly, a little bit overbuilt. So there are all kinds of reasons why even for-profit focused developers should be interested in developing this way. We just need to continue to push that messaging in a way that makes sense for the performance of the asset as much as it does for the community's benefit as well.
Well, thank you all for hanging with us through this most important panel. And please give my distinguished panel a hand. These folks are at the tip of the spear around social impact and opportunity zones. And we really appreciate them coming down and taking the time. So let's give them a hand.